After a traumatic childbirth, David Phillips decided to bring a dog into their home, hoping it would bring some joy to their paralyzed son, something they desperately needed. However, what unfolded just a few months after the dog joined their family left everyone stunned. It was a sweltering afternoon in their quiet Florida neighborhood. The sun bore down relentlessly, making even the air feel heavy. David felt restless, as if the heat itself had seeped into his bones. It wasn't just the weather, it was everything. His mind was tangled with worried thoughts he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. Today was Lucas's first birthday, and David wanted it to be special, memorable, even though nothing about the past year had gone as planned. Before Lucas's birth, he and his wife had spent countless hours talking about how they would celebrate their son's first birthday. They had imagined a grand party, a backyard filled with family and friends, balloons, and a cake shaped like Lucas's favorite animals. They even joked about getting a pet, a puppy maybe, to complete the perfect picture. But those dreams felt distant now, like they belonged to a different life. The past few months had been filled with doctor visits, sleepless nights, and the slow realization that life would never be the same. Instead of the party, David had turned his attention to something more meaningful, something that might actually make a difference in a dog. He had heard from others that sometimes a pet could offer more comfort than any medicine or therapy. And so, as a father desperate to do anything for his child, David latched onto the idea. When he walked into the local animal shelter, the air was thick with the sound of barking. The dogs, eager for attention, wagged their tails and paced back and forth in their kennels. David scanned the room, his eyes darting from one dog to the next, unsure of what he was looking for, but knowing he'd feel it when he saw the right one. Then, something caught his eye. A small, curious English toy terrier. She wasn't the loudest, nor the biggest, but there was something about the way she looked at him, her head slightly cocked to the side, that made him pause. David had read about different dog breeds, wanting to make sure whatever dog he brought home would be the right fit for Lucas. This little terrier seemed perfect, small enough not to overwhelm his son, but with a heart full of loyalty and a gentle spirit. He couldn't help but imagine how Lucas's eyes might light up at the sight of the dog, a spark of happiness breaking through the quiet that had settled over their home. The birth had been brutal, more than David had ever prepared for. When Lucas had come into the world, the room had fallen into an eerie silence, the kind that makes your heart stop in your chest. For a moment, David feared the worst. But then a sharp cry pierced the quiet, and David felt a wave of relief wash over him. His son's lungs were strong, his cries loud and full of life, but the trauma of that day lingered, hanging over them like a shadow. And he was alive. The doctors whisked the newborn away to another room, not even giving David or his wife a chance to hold him first. That moment stayed etched in David's mind. The nurse's expression, the weight of the situation, how it shook him to his core. David had never felt fear like that in his life. Pacing back and forth in the waiting room, he vividly remembered the doctor's words. Lucas had been born with a damaged spine due to complications during delivery. His son was paralyzed from the waist down, and while the chances of him walking were slim, there was still a sliver of hope. Clinging to that hope, David agreed to endless physical therapy sessions, determined to keep a positive attitude for Lucas. His wife, on the other hand, struggled in her own battle, blaming herself for Lucas's condition and sinking into postpartum depression. She distanced herself from Lucas and the therapy sessions, leaving David to shoulder the burden of medical bills and long, lonely hours at the hospital. David knew his son needed more stimulation, more than what therapy could offer, and suggested getting a dog. His wife, wrapped in her own sorrow, barely showed any interest. The idea of throwing Lucas the grand birthday party they had once dreamed of was now impossible. But David, ever hopeful, thought maybe adopting a dog could bring some joy back into their lives. When he saw the English toy terrier at the shelter, something just clicked. David felt a connection right away. The little dog, with its devoted and gentle nature, seemed like the perfect match for his son. According to some experts, physical stimulation from a playful dog could strengthen the muscles of a paralyzed person, pushing them beyond their perceived limits. David didn't believe that the dog would miraculously teach Lucas to crawl or walk, but he did know that it could turn his son's dull days into adventures. The process of adopting the terrier was straightforward: papers to sign, fees to pay. But beneath the routine of it all, David was filled with a mixture of excitement and hope. He knew this dog could make a difference. Bringing the newly adopted pet home felt like the start of a new chapter in their lives, one that might finally hold a little more light. As David drove back, his thoughts swirled with anxiety. How would Lucas react to this surprise? Would he be afraid of the dog? Would the dog be scared of him? He didn't have answers, but he knew he would find out soon enough. The sun was dipping lower in the sky as David pulled into the driveway. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, his heart racing in anticipation. He looked over at the small dog sitting calmly in the passenger seat, as if she somehow knew the importance of this moment. This was more than just bringing home a pet. For David, this was about offering his son a glimmer of something they had both been missing: hope, connection, maybe even a little happiness. He took a deep breath and opened the door. With the tiny terrier in his arms, David walked up to the front door, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing down on him. Lucas deserved something good, something joyful, and David was determined to give it to him. As he stepped inside, his wife barely looked up from the couch, lost in her own thoughts. But David didn't need her approval today. This was for Lucas. And, as he crossed the threshold into his son's room, he whispered to the dog, "All right, girl, let's make today special for him." Before heading home, David stopped by the local bakery to pick up a cake. After all, it was his son's birthday, and he knew his wife hadn't baked anything. Along with the cake, he chose a cute little bow for the dog, a small touch to make the moment even more special. As he drove back home, carrying the surprise cake and the adorable terrier in the passenger seat, David felt nervous but hopeful. He knew the next few steps were crucial in improving the atmosphere at home. When he opened the front door and let the terrier in, his wife stood in the hallway, arms crossed, her expression hard. "Seriously?" she asked, her voice sharp with frustration. "Now I have to take care of both a baby and a dog while you spend all day at your office." David felt the sting of her words, but he refused to let his smile turn into a grimace. He knew she was suffering just as much as he was, and that she still had a long way to go before she could even begin to feel like herself again. Taking a deep breath, he calmly explained, "I've already spoken with the housekeeper. She's going to take care of the dog in the mornings, and I'll handle the walks in the evening. The terrier will distract Lucas enough so you'll have more time for yourself." His wife let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You want me to leave our son alone with a dog he doesn't even know?" "Of course not," David replied, holding his growing frustration in check. He had to stay calm for Lucas's sake, for all of them. "I just need you to supervise them while they play together." "He can't play. He can't even crawl yet," she snapped, her voice rising in anger. "He'll learn," David said, his tone firm, signaling the end of the conversation. His wife huffed in response, grabbed the cake from his hands, and walked toward the kitchen, her movements sharp and frustrated. David sighed and made his way to Lucas's room. As usual, the baby lay in his crib, clutching a stuffed toy to his chest. He babbled softly, his tiny voice filling the room, but there was no one there to talk back, no one to engage him in play. David's heart clenched with sorrow as he watched his son. Lucas rarely left his room, never interacting with other children or the world beyond the four walls of their home. The house felt like a fortress, trapping them all in an endless loop of sadness and helplessness. David stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. The silence in the room seemed to stretch on, broken only by Lucas's soft cooing. He knelt down by the crib, placing a hand on his son's tiny back. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got someone for you to meet." He reached into the small basket beside him and pulled out the little bow, then tied it carefully around the terrier's neck. The dog sat patiently at David's feet, its dark eyes watching Lucas with curiosity. "I think you two are going to be good friends," David said, gently lifting Lucas out of the crib. He placed him on the floor next to the terrier, who immediately sniffed the baby, wagging its tail. Lucas giggled, his small hands reaching out to touch the dog's soft fur. For the first time in months, David saw a real smile light up his son's face. It was small, but it was there. And in that moment, all the tension, the arguments, the fear, they all faded away, just for a second. David sat down on the floor beside them, watching as Lucas babbled happily, patting the terrier's head. It was a small moment, but it felt like a step forward, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed their lives. Little Lucas was on the verge of gaining a lifelong friend. David held his son close, cradling him gently as he walked towards the living room. The dog, still wearing the cute little bow they'd tied on earlier, let out a soft bark as they entered the room. Lucas's eyes lit up with excitement the moment he saw the furry companion. His tiny hands reached out eagerly toward the terrier. David carefully placed him on the ground and sat behind him, giving a light whistle to catch the dog's attention. The small dog, tail wagging excitedly, cautiously approached the boy. Lucas reached out, his fingers brushing the terrier's head, letting out a delighted squeal. For just a moment, the room felt brighter. Even David's wife, who had been distant and withdrawn, cracked a small smile. As days passed, the dog quickly became a part of their household, an essential piece of their lives. Every morning before heading to work, David made sure to feed the dog, ensuring it was well taken care of. Their housekeeper helped too, making sure the dog had water and food throughout the day. David's wife, however, remained mostly indifferent to the new addition. But Lucas, well, he had found his playful companion. The boy, once so quiet and withdrawn, was now laughing constantly, spending his days with his furry friend. The terrier brought out a side of him that David hadn't seen in months. His wife, at first hesitant, began to notice the changes in Lucas too. Slowly, her own mood started to lift. She began to care for herself a bit more, paying attention to the small joys in life. One evening, as they sat watching Lucas play, she looked over at David and said, "We should name him Max." "Max," David echoed with a smile, watching their son giggle as Max wagged his tail. The name stuck, and as weeks went by, Max became more than just a pet. He was Lucas's shadow, always by his side, always gentle, as if he knew Lucas's limitations. The little boy who once struggled to sit up now was able to roll over on the floor, chasing after Max in their makeshift games. The dog seemed to understand when Lucas needed time to catch up, patiently waiting for him to close the gap before darting forward again. Lucas's physical therapy sessions were also going well. His muscles were getting stronger, and though he still couldn't crawl, his progress brought a renewed sense of hope to David. Each session, Lucas's determination grew, spurred on by his desire to play with Max. The therapist was amazed at how much Lucas had improved. Even David's wife, who had struggled so much after the traumatic birth, had softened. She began spending more time with Lucas and Max, joining them in their playful moments. Seeing her smile again, hearing her laugh with their son, melted David's heart. Max wasn't just a pet. He was the key to healing their family. Months passed and Lucas continued to make strides. Eventually, his knees began to bend. His doctor was thrilled with his progress, and one day, after a particularly successful therapy session, David and his wife found themselves in tears of joy. Their son, despite everything, was growing stronger. It was Max's playful presence that had inspired Lucas to strengthen his muscles, to keep pushing forward. The dog was more than just a companion. He was Lucas's motivation. Day by day, the family grew closer, bound by the love they all had for their little boy and his faithful dog, Max. The dog had become more than just a gift. He was a symbol of hope, of recovery, and of the simple joys that had once seemed lost to them. One afternoon, while David was at work, his phone buzzed with an urgent call. His wife's voice trembled with excitement on the other end. "David! You won't believe this! Lucas! He's crawling, David! Max! It's a miracle!" Her words were barely coherent as she struggled to describe what had just unfolded. David's heart leapt, a rush of warmth spreading through him. That night, they celebrated with a homemade cake, the air thick with laughter and joy, as if the weight of their worries had lifted, if only for a little while. Not long after, on a quiet morning, David sat in his study, going over paperwork, when Max, their loyal terrier, began barking in a way that wasn't quite like him. It was more than playful yaps. It was urgent, almost frantic. Curious and slightly alarmed, David peeked into the living room where Max and Lucas were playing together. The dog's insistent bark seemed to hint that something big was about to happen. At first, David was amused, thinking Max was just in one of his mischievous moods. But the dog's persistence made him uneasy. Max wasn't letting up. His eyes locked on David as if to say, "You need to see this." David couldn't shake the feeling. "All right, Max," he murmured, following the dog towards the living room, his curiosity growing by the second. Lucas sat there on the floor, surrounded by his toy soldiers, his tiny hands moving them around in battle formations. But something was off, something that made David's pulse quicken. Then, in a single heart-stopping moment, David noticed Lucas was standing. Not crawling, not supported by any crutch or walker, but standing tall, his legs firm beneath him. David's knees buckled, and he had to steady himself against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. His throat tightened, his heart racing. It felt impossible, too surreal to be true. But there was his son, his precious boy, standing on his own 2 feet, something every doctor had told them would never happen. Tears blurred David's vision as he choked on a sob. He couldn't contain it anymore. The emotion, the disbelief, the joy it all poured out. Lucas, noticing his father standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his face, furrowed his little brows, clearly confused. "Daddy? Are you sad?" His voice was so innocent, so concerned, as he set his toy soldiers aside and turned his full attention to David. David quickly wiped his eyes, though the tears kept coming, unchecked. "No, Lucas, I'm not sad," he managed, his voice cracking with emotion. I'm so happy." And it was true, he had never been happier in his entire life. Lucas giggled, a light-hearted sound that broke through the tension and returned to his toys. David, still in shock, rushed to the bathroom, barely keeping it together. He flung open the door and found his wife there, still in her robe, fixing her hair. Without a word, David grabbed her by the hand and pulled her back to the living room. She protested in confusion at first, but the second her eyes fell on Lucas, still standing, she froze. Her breath hitched, and she let out a soft gasp before sinking to the floor in disbelief, tears welling up in her eyes. The weight of the moment hit her just as hard as it had hit David. She couldn't believe it. None of them could. And now, in front of their little boy, both parents were crying, their tears a mixture of overwhelming joy and astonishment. "Mommy, you too?" Lucas squeaked, his eyes wide as he looked from his mother to his father. He shuffled his feet, maintaining his balance, something that not too long ago seemed like an impossible dream. He still couldn't understand why his parents were so emotional, but to him, this was just another morning of play. But for David and his wife, it was the dawn of something they'd never thought they'd see, standing right there in front of them, in the form of their son. Through her tears, David's wife asked softly, "Can you come over here, sweetie?" Lucas looked down at his trembling legs, unsure if he could make it across the room to his mum. It was then that his best friend, Max, stepped in to help. The little terrier bounded over to Lucas, positioning himself right at the boy's side, allowing Lucas to rest his small, unsteady hand on Max's back for balance. With Max by his side, the 2-year-old toddler, wobbling but determined, started toward his mother. David watched with bated breath, encouraging his son every step of the way. Twice, Lucas nearly stumbled, but Max stayed steady, walking slowly in time with the child's hesitant steps, never leaving his side. When Lucas finally reached his mother's waiting arms, a wave of relief and joy swept over the room. Even Max let out a cheerful bark, his tail wagging as though he understood the triumph of the moment. The small terrier, the one David had brought home just a year ago, had somehow become the very key to helping his son take his first steps. Overwhelmed by emotion, David scooped Max up into his arms and gave him a tight, grateful hug. This was a moment that made the family see Max in a whole new light. They could hardly believe what this little dog had done for them. In the most unexpected and profound way, Max had helped Lucas overcome the obstacles that had seemed impossible just months ago. He brought back the light to his wife's face, the joy to his son's heart, and helped David feel like his family was whole again. For a dog so small, Max had done something monumental, something that words could hardly capture, and David knew, deep in his heart, that he would forever be grateful to Max for the gift he had given them, all a moment that changed everything. The bond between them had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. "Good boy, Max," David whispered, brushing a hand over the terrier's soft fur. His heart swelled with gratitude. This was more than just a dog. Max was a miracle wrapped in fur, a quiet hero in their everyday life. What an incredible journey, right? It's truly amazing how a little dog like Max can make such a huge impact on a family's life. Moments like these remind us that sometimes help and hope come from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart like it did ours, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who could use a little inspiration. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on more uplifting stories like this one. Thanks for being here with us today. And as always, stay tuned for more heartwarming moments. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next video.